They painted the sky onto their wings. That was the idea. If the night was black, then black would make them vanish. Simple, logical, deadly wrong. In 1941, young ground crews at Waddington brushed layer after layer of flat night paint over the flanks of the new Lancaster bombers. The hangar smelled of fuel, rubber, and turpentine. Under the lamps, the surface turned velvet, so dark it seemed to swallow the air around it. One mechanic said softly, "When she climbs into the night, even God won't see her." Everyone laughed, but no one doubted it. Across the channel, Luftwaffe armorers did the same to their Heinkel bombers, using RLM-22 Schwarz. The coating was rough, dull, and almost sticky, built to absorb every photon that touched it. Pilots in leather jackets ran their hands along the fuselage before takeoff, half believing that this darkness would guard them like a second skin. It was the same in the States. Engineers of the arsenal of democracy sent out instructions to darken the bellies of flying fortresses and marauders. Night meant safety, and safety came in a can marked lamp black matte. Nobody questioned the chemistry of hope, but war has a way of mocking human logic. The first missions exposed a strange truth. Europe's night sky was not black. At 20,000 feet, above clouds lit by city fires and moonlight, the heavens were a pale blue-gray. A bomber painted black didn't melt into that light. It sliced across it like a moving shadow. British gunners were the first to notice. During a raid over Hamburg, one of them shouted through the intercom, "I can see them, our own boys, plain as ink on paper." The darker the paint, the sharper the outline. Against the luminous haze of the upper atmosphere, black looked like a hole where the sky should be. Reports reached command, but disbelief ran deep. "Impossible," said one officer. "The enemy sees what he wants to see." Orders continued, maintain full matte finish on all night operations. Belief, after all, travels faster than data. Then came the cold mathematics. Tests at Boscombe Down showed that the flat finish created drag, tiny, invisible ripples of air clinging to the rough surface. A Lancaster lost nearly 15 miles per hour at cruise speed. That meant fewer chances to outrun flak bursts, fewer seconds to climb out of a searchlight cone. And each coat of pigment added weight, over 200 pounds of it, stealing fuel range that crews would have killed for. They did not see the numbers. They only felt it. The controls grew heavier, the climb slower. Mechanics swore the airplane sounded tired. A bomber chief wrote in his log, "We gave her darkness, and it made her weak." Over Cologne, the illusion broke entirely. A full squadron of black-painted bombers crossed a cloud deck under a half-moon. German gunners didn't need radar that night. The silhouettes were perfect, each wingtip clear, each fuselage gleaming faintly like a mark on silver paper. They fired by eye, and the sky burned. When survivors returned to England, no one spoke of color. They just washed the soot from their faces and stared at the black paint that had promised safety. One crewman traced a finger across a bullet hole and whispered, "The night betrayed us." The next morning, a worker at Avro scrawled a note on the hangar wall. "Black does not hide you from the moon." It stayed there for months, faint under layers of new paint, until the day another engineer finally asked, "Then what does?" And that single question began to unravel the myth that darkness could protect man from the laws of light. The first engineers who tried to explain it faced a kind of disbelief no graph could cure. They said the problem was not the paint, but the physics, not camouflage, but contrast. At altitude, the world was a mirror. The upper sky glowed faintly from the scattering of city lights hundreds of miles below. Even when the ground lay in darkness, the stratosphere held a blue-gray shine that human eyes could sense, but never describe. Against that luminous veil, black was not invisible, it was absolute. A hole, a moving void that drew attention instead of hiding it. Photographic tests in 1942 confirmed it. A Spitfire coated in deep night black stood out clearly against the dawn haze. The same plane, repainted in a pale blue-gray, almost vanished. The conclusion was merciless. The darker the aircraft, the sharper its silhouette. And then came the second blow, drag. The flat microtexture of the matte surface caught air like sandpaper. Wind tunnel trials measured a loss of nearly 20 miles per hour at cruise speed and a climb penalty that could decide survival. The Luftwaffe found the same. RLM-22 Schwarz reduced the performance of their Ju-88 night bombers enough that some crews stripped the paint entirely, flying bare metal even on moonlit raids. For the men in the cockpit, none of this felt theoretical. They saw it in the trembling needle of the airspeed indicator, in the seconds stolen from every evasive turn. One pilot later wrote, "You could feel the darkness dragging at your wings." Worse still, the matte surface aged badly. Rain streaked it, oil spotted it, and frost turned it glossy in patches, an uneven, glittering target for every searchlight beam. What had been meant to swallow light now caught it in scars and smudges. RAF scientists began to test alternate formulas, adding ultramarine pigment to bend the tone toward navy blue, experimenting with smooth night, a semi-gloss finish meant to restore airflow while keeping reflectivity low. It was a fragile compromise, but it hinted at a larger truth. Perfect blackness was the enemy of invisibility. That realization shook the foundations of wartime doctrine. If black betrayed you, what color could save you? The answer arrived not from a laboratory, but from the night sky itself. Pilots returning from missions noticed that the undersides of clouds reflected city fires in dull copper tones, while the upper sky shimmered silver beneath the moon. True concealment lay somewhere between those hues, neither dark nor bright, but uncertain. In late 1942, the RAF began painting the bellies of Mosquito night fighters in medium sea gray, while keeping the tops dark green. From above, they blended with earth and forest. From below, they blurred into haze. It worked, not perfectly, but better than faith in pure black ever had. The Luftwaffe reached a similar conclusion on its own. Engineers at Reckland developed a scheme using RLM-76 Lichtblau, a pale blue that melted into moonlight. Over that, they sprayed irregular model patterns of gray-violet to shatter the outline. Under searchlight glare, these aircraft flickered in and out of sight like ghosts. Still, no one could escape the paradox. The better the camouflage looked to the eye, the worse it performed in airspeed. Every drop of paint meant more drag, more fuel burned, less chance to return home. The physics of light fought the physics of motion, and both sides claimed their share of lives. By early 1943, a weary consensus formed. You could not hide from the sky by pretending to be its color. The atmosphere itself would betray you, scattering light in ways no man could predict. Yet even as data proved the myth wrong, belief died slowly. Many commanders kept ordering black finishes simply because they looked formidable, a visual declaration of purpose. The paint remained a symbol long after it ceased to work. In the quiet of the research sheds, one physicist scribbled a note beneath a failed paint sample. "We cannot defeat the light. We can only learn to fly through it." And that, quietly, reluctantly, marked the birth of a new war. A war no longer fought between bombers and searchlights, but between perception and reality itself. The war had entered its cruel middle years. Every side had learned just enough physics to know how wrong they had been, yet not enough to stop losing men. In briefing rooms, commanders argued over colors, while pilots measured survival in minutes. Paint orders changed weekly. One day it was black only, the next smooth finish, then semi-gloss. Each shift meant another round of confusion for the mechanics who brushed the war onto metal. At first, the logic seemed simple. Fix the drag, adjust the tone, trust the data. But fear ignored data. The men who flew through flat clouds at 15,000 feet didn't care what the laboratory graphs said. They wanted something that felt safe, and black still looked safe. A crewman on a Sterling bomber told a correspondent, "When she's black, she feels like she belongs to the night." It wasn't science anymore. It was superstition. Even the Luftwaffe clung to the same ritual. Their night fighters, once bare metal, were repainted again in dark gray. One German pilot recalled, "Command said it helped morale. The color didn't matter, but we needed to believe it did." And belief has its own inertia. Behind the lines, test reports piled up. Engineers at Farnborough calculated that each additional coat of matte black cost 100 gallons of fuel per mission. Yet, mission planners refused to reduce payloads. The arithmetic didn't lie, but people did to themselves. "We can't tell the crews their paint is killing their range," one officer said quietly. "Let them believe." So they flew heavier, slower, and closer to the edge of their endurance. When radar-controlled searchlights locked onto a formation, the drag that once seemed abstract now meant death measured in seconds. A gunner on a Halifax wrote in his diary, "We can't turn fast enough. The paint pulls us down like wet cloth." By 1943, the contradictions had become unbearable. Crews no longer trusted the orders. Some units scraped paint off their leading edges. Others polished their aircraft with oil to gain a few extra miles per hour. Command called it insubordination. The airmen called it survival. The Luftwaffe was no different. Ground crews working in the dark mixed leftover paints to match whatever shade of gray they had left. The once proud color codes, RLM numbers printed on blueprints, were replaced by guesswork. The war had outpaced its own bureaucracy. One German mechanic later admitted, "We stopped painting for the sky. We painted for our conscience." In America, production lines at Lockheed and Douglas struggled to keep pace with new directives. A telegram from Washington ordered that all future night aircraft use anti-glare finish, color optional. It was the bureaucratic way of admitting defeat. Color optional meant, we no longer know what works. And still, the losses continued. The statistics were pitiless. The 8th Air Force reported more than 1,000 bombers lost in 6 months, not all to fighters or flak, but many to navigation errors, mid-air collisions, and fuel starvation caused by drag. The illusion of camouflage had stolen range, the physics of drag had stolen speed, and fear had stolen judgment. Out of that chaos, a few quiet minds began to see the pattern. They realized the problem wasn't color or chemistry, it was human instinct. The same impulse that made a pilot duck under fire also made him trust what his eyes told him. Yet in the war above the clouds, eyes were liars. That realization, bitter and late, opened the door for a new kind of solution, one that would not rely on sight at all. Somewhere in a workshop at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a group of engineers began sketching something radical. A gun sight that could think faster than fear. And with that, the war of color gave way to a war of computation. It began quietly, inside the laboratories that smelled of solvent and coffee. The war outside raged on, but inside, men with tired eyes studied the colors of the sky. At the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, scientists coated metal panels in every tone between midnight and dawn, blue-black, gray-green, violet ash, and hung them under floodlights to mimic the moon. They found something maddening. The darker the paint, the sharper the edge appeared. True concealment came from imperfection, from tones that wavered between shades, fooling the eye before it could define a border. One researcher scrawled a note, "We've been painting shadows, not skies." That was the moment reason began to push back against ritual. RAF engineers replaced night black with a new formula called smooth night, a semi-gloss finish mixed with ultramarine pigment to bend reflection toward the faint blue of high altitude. It looked almost beautiful, like wet ink, but under test flights it proved faster. The smooth surface let air slip again over the fuselage. When crews returned from trial missions, they spoke of it in disbelief. "She feels alive again," a pilot said. "The wings don't fight the air anymore." It wasn't camouflage in the old sense. It was physics finally cooperating. Across the channel, German engineers at Reslin reached the same revelation. Their night fighters began trading the absolute black of RLM-22 for RLM-76 Lichtblau, a pale blue that blended into moonlit haze. Over that, they sprayed irregular model patterns of gray and violet. The result looked chaotic, but chaos hid better than order. A Luftwaffe colonel watching one of these newly painted Bf-110s murmured, "Now the night has clouds of its own." No one spoke of victory anymore, only of survival measured in shades. By 1943, both sides had abandoned the dream of vanishing completely. They began to chase something subtler, a harmony with the sky rather than a disguise from it. In England, the Mosquito night fighter became the test bed for this new philosophy. Its upper surfaces wore dark green and ocean gray, its belly a pale tone that vanished against moonlit cloud. It didn't disappear, it dissolved. German radar operators later admitted that sometimes the echoes came without a silhouette. It was there, one said, and then it wasn't. For the Luftwaffe, the lesson turned desperate. Shortages of pigment forced improvisation. Mechanics mixed leftover paints by hand, creating strange, uneven streaks that shifted hue under different light. To their surprise, those flaws helped. The modeling scattered searchlight beams and confused enemy observers. What industry called inconsistency became the soldiers' salvation. Somewhere in an MIT hangar, American engineers studied both sides' failures. They didn't want compromise. They wanted control. From their sketches would emerge a mechanical answer, one that replaced the eye entirely. But for now, the scientists of every nation shared the same realization. Perfection was fatal. The more uniform a surface, the easier it was to see. Under that dim wartime logic, imperfection became invisible. As a British physicist wrote in a private note that winter, nature does not hide by being dark. She hides by being complicated. And so the sky, once thought to be an enemy to deceive, became a teacher instead. The men who studied its color learned humility, because the harder they tried to outsmart it, the more it reminded them that war could never bend the laws of light. When the Americans entered the night war, they refused to paint by superstition. The engineers at Northrop faced a new problem, how to make an aircraft both invisible and fast. Their answer was neither gray nor compromise. It was jet black. In 1943, the P-61 Black Widow rolled out of the California sun wearing the deepest gloss black the War Department had ever approved. It shocked everyone. The British had abandoned black entirely. The Germans had turned to pale blue. Yet here stood an American night fighter that gleamed like polished obsidian. To some, it looked like madness. "Why make it shine?" one observer asked. The chief designer, Jack Northrop, replied, "Because smoothness is stealth." The semi-reflective surface reduced friction where air met metal. In daylight it glinted faintly, but under starlight it melted into the horizon. Radar would find it long before human eyes did, so performance, not pigment, was the new defense. Test flights over the Mojave proved him right. The Black Widow climbed faster than any night fighter before it, carrying 4 20-millimeter cannons and 4 50-caliber machine guns under that gleaming skin. Pilots reported cleaner handling, better acceleration, and less turbulence at high speed. The paint wasn't camouflage, it was engineering. When the first squadron arrived in the Pacific, ground crews worked through the humid nights, applying fresh coats of ANA 622 jet black. The finish gleamed under floodlights like oil over water. Within weeks of combat, salt air and engine heat dulled the sheen to a satin gray. What began as a symbol of defiance weathered itself into the perfect compromise, half reflective, half forgiving. One crew chief said, "She starts out proud, but the jungle teaches her humility." In the field, the P-61 proved its worth. Radar operators tracked Japanese bombers long before anyone saw them. When the Black Widow closed in, her glossy surface shed heat quickly, keeping the engines cooler through violent climbs. Physics had become an ally again. To the enemy, the aircraft appeared too late to matter. A shadow among searchlights, its twin booms flickered once, guns flashing, and then it was gone. After the raid on Saipan, a young pilot described it best. "We weren't hiding anymore. We were outrunning the night itself." Back home, factories at Hawthorne and Minneapolis struggled to keep pace. Paint production became a logistics front all its own. Hundreds of barrels of synthetic lacquer traveled by Liberty ship, each drum labeled jet black non-reflective gloss. It was a contradiction only America could mass produce, gloss that was meant to be unseen. Historians would later call it an industrial paradox. While Europe painted to blend with the sky, America painted to master it. The choice reflected more than chemistry. It revealed a nation's mindset. The United States had no interest in bowing to nature. It intended to outbuild it, outthink it, and if needed, outshine it. The pilots of the Black Widow didn't speak of color. They spoke of confidence. They trusted their radar screens more than their eyes, their engines more than luck. One of them said, "The black doesn't hide us. It reminds us who we are. We fight in the open." And for the first time in the war, black was no longer a symbol of fear. It had become the color of control, the moment when technology replaced faith, and engineering learned to turn the night itself into a weapon. By the winter of 1943, the sky itself had changed, not in color, but in the way men fought beneath it. For decades, every theory of survival in the air began with the eye, what it could see, what it could not. Yet that winter, something colder and far more merciless replaced it, the cathode glow of radar. In a darkened control room in England, technicians watched a green screen bloom with echoes, small arcs of light marking bombers miles away. The human eye was obsolete. Color no longer mattered. Speed and altitude could not save you if the machine had already seen you. The British called their network Chain Home, a forest of tall steel towers ringing the coast. In Germany, the same revolution spread through the Freya and Würzburg arrays. And aboard American night fighters, new instruments hummed. A tiny pulse radar called SCR-720, the beating heart of the P-61 Black Widow. A radar operator once described it like this: "You don't look out there anymore, you look inside the light." Suddenly, the centuries-old art of camouflage, concealing shape, tricking light, fooling perception, collapsed under a hum of electronics. Every coat of paint, every argument about gloss or matte now seemed like a relic from another age. The engineers who had spent years studying pigment and drag now recalculated wavelengths and beam cones. They learned that radar waves ignored color entirely. The sky didn't care what you looked like, only what you reflected. And reflection was the new enemy. To fight the invisible, scientists began to invent a different kind of darkness. They called it absorption. The same laboratories that once tested camouflage paints now coated panels in carbon and rubber, seeking materials that could swallow radio energy instead of light. Early experiments were crude, thin mats glued to the noses of bombers, mixtures that cracked under cold air, but the seed had been planted. The concept of stealth was born long before the word existed. For the men in the cockpit, the change felt spiritual. No longer did they stare into the blackness for silhouettes. They listened to the hiss of the radar speaker, to the rhythmic blip that told them life or death in seconds. A British operator remembered his first mission with radar guidance. "I saw nothing through the canopy, only the screen. The enemy was a dot of green light, and when that dot vanished, I felt as though the world had gone blind." Some resisted the transition. Veteran pilots trusted their eyes and intuition, not a flickering display. They called radar a thief of courage, a machine that made war impersonal, but those who adapted lived longer. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's last night fighters flew into skies they could not control. Allied radar locked onto them before a single human glance. The war that began with men painting shadows had become a war of pure electricity. When it was over, the black aircraft of every nation sat quietly on airfields, their paint faded by salt and sun. The machines that had once chased the perfect darkness were now relics of an era when men thought the night could be fooled. In the silence of victory, one American engineer at MIT wrote a final line in his notebook: "The eye was our oldest instrument. The machine has taken it away." And with that, the age of light and shadow ended, replaced forever by the age of signal and silence. The war ended, but its shadows did not. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world kept the lessons of light and darkness hidden inside laboratories, paint codes, and notebooks. Factories that once mixed camouflage pigments now produced coatings for jet engines, radar domes, and guided missiles. The same engineers who once feared moonlight now studied how to bend it, trap it, and erase it. From the British Mark 14 gyro gun sight to the American Phalanx CIWS, the logic survived. Aim where the target will be, not where it is. It was the same philosophy born from those experiments in misjudged color, understanding that human senses lag behind physics. In the United States, new aircraft gleamed in bare aluminum, polished to mirror brightness. Designers understood that true concealment no longer came from darkness, but from speed and distance. Then, in secret hangars of the Cold War, scientists at Lockheed began to whisper the old dream again, to make a plane vanish. Only this time, they didn't turn to paint, they turned to equations. The A-12 Oxcart, ancestor of the Blackbird, wore a skin infused with iron ferrite, tuned to absorb radar waves. It shimmered dark blue, not black under the Nevada sun, a perfect descendant of every bomber that had once failed to disappear. And when the F-117 Nighthawk finally took flight decades later, its color wasn't superstition. It was computation. Every facet, every angle, every molecule calculated to scatter light and radio alike. Those stealth coatings traced their ancestry to the same wartime chemists who once stared at failed panels under artificial moonlight. The lineage of mistakes had become the blueprint of mastery, yet there was something human that no machine could replicate, the memory of men who had tried to outsmart the sky with a brush and a bucket of paint. At the Imperial War Museum in London, a single Lancaster still stands in her wartime finish, flat, black, and heavy with dust. Visitors often call her beautiful. The guides rarely correct them, but for those who know the science, that color is both memorial and confession. It represents the cost of misunderstanding nature and the courage to keep learning. In Germany, restorers of surviving night fighters debate which shade of gray to use, RLM 75, 76, or something in between. One of them once said, "There is no right color anymore, only stories." And in the Smithsonian, beneath bright hangar lights, the P-61 Black Widow gleams again, polished darker than midnight. Children stand beneath its wings and point upward, unaware that its shine once meant survival. The legacy of darkness is not about vanishing, it's about vision. The night taught humanity that invisibility is not absence, but understanding. The physicists had been right all along. You cannot defeat light, only learn to live within its rules. The sky never stopped being a battlefield. It simply changed weapons. Radar replaced eyesight, stealth replaced paint, and knowledge replaced fear. But in every echo of a returning signal, in every reflection on a polished wing, there remains a trace of that first illusion, an echo of the time when men believed the night was black. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, that in trying to hide from the light, humanity finally learned how to see. The war ended 80 years ago, yet its logic never did. The same questions that once haunted the paint sheds of Waddington and Recklin now echo inside glass laboratories and computer rooms. How to vanish, how to survive, how to master the unseen. The brush has become an algorithm. Where men once stirred pigment in buckets, engineers now stir data, modeling wavelengths, reflection coefficients, and radar cross-sections measured in millionths of an inch. The new camouflage is written, not painted. Every stealth aircraft that rises from the Nevada desert still carries the ghost of those black bombers. The equations may be digital, but their ancestry is chemical. Layers of carbon composite and radar-absorbent polymer trace a direct bloodline to the lamp-black pigment of 1942. The human desire is unchanged, to find a way through the light without being consumed by it. Inside simulators, artificial skies flicker across monitors. Code replaces moonlight. An invisible hand adjusts angles, scattering energy instead of brushstrokes. One engineer calls it digital paint. Another simply says, "We're still chasing the same dream, just faster." And somewhere, between physics and imagination, the old paradox remains. You cannot hide from the world by painting yourself darker. You can only learn to predict what the light will do next. When historians look back on the age of stealth, they may not see a break from the past at all, but a continuation, proof that every failure in those war-torn hangars was never wasted. The color black taught humanity humility, the radar taught it patience, and the code, quietly, invisibly, taught it precision. In the end, the difference between a brushstroke and a line of code is only time. Both are human attempts to speak to the sky, and to ask one more time the oldest question in flight: how do you disappear without being lost?